April 1945. The call of the ruins. The world was ending, or so it seemed. The sky hung low and gray over a city that no longer breathed. The streets were littered with bricks, broken glass, and the smell of burned wood. They told us the fatherland needed every last soul. That included me, 12 years old, small for my age, and shaking as they handed me a uniform that hung loose on my shoulders like a shroud. I still remember the officer's voice, "For the Reich, for honor." But all I could think was that I still had homework in my satchel and a mother waiting for me with soup that no longer existed. The uniform smelled of mold and fear. When I looked around, I saw boys even younger than me, faces hollowed by hunger, eyes old and empty. We were soldiers only by name. Someone pinned a badge to my chest. It was too heavy, like everything else that day. They told us that our courage would save Germany. But courage, I learned quickly, couldn't fill a stomach or stop a bullet. That night, I lay on a cold floor inside a ruined school, listening to distant artillery. The adults whispered about the final push, as if victory could be pulled from the ashes. But even I knew, it was over. The walls trembled with each explosion, and dust fell like snow. Somewhere out there, my mother was probably lighting a candle, praying for a son who was already halfway gone. In the morning, a sergeant marched in, boots slapping against broken tiles. His voice echoed off the walls, "You are soldiers of the Reich now, you will defend our homeland." His eyes were red, not from passion but from sleepless nights. He handed me an old rifle. The wood was splintered, the barrel rusted, I could barely lift it. When he saw me struggle, he frowned. "Hold it like a man," he muttered, but I wasn't a man. I was a frightened child wearing the ruins of one. My hands trembled so violently that the rifle clattered against the ground. He didn't punish me, he simply turned away, as if too tired to care. Outside, the world had become a graveyard of silence. Smoke rose from the horizon where towns once stood. Crows circled overhead, their cries the only thing that moved. I watched a group of older boys march toward the front line, their boots sinking into mud and memory. None of them looked back. I tried to imagine what defending the homeland meant when the homeland itself had collapsed into rubble. Every echo of gunfire seemed to come from inside my own chest. I wanted to run, to find my mother, to pretend this nightmare was only a bad dream. But the sergeant's order still rang in my ears, binding me to a war I barely understood. That night, I stood guard near a burned-out house. The moonlight cast long shadows across the ruins. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. One last time, perhaps. I looked at my reflection in a shattered window. The face staring back wasn't mine anymore. The war had taken it, and given me a ghost instead. The next morning, we were told to prepare for battle. The Americans were advancing fast. The sergeant barked orders, his voice hoarse from shouting into the void. I looked down at the rifle in my hands, still too heavy, still foreign. The metal was cold against my skin, like the touch of something that didn't belong to the living. Somewhere deep inside, I hoped the fighting would end before it reached us. But the sound of engines and distant thunder said otherwise. The ruins called, and we answered. April 1945. The rifle that was too heavy. They handed me the rifle at dawn, as the mist still clung to the ruins like ghosts, refusing to leave. It was an old bolt-action weapon, the kind my grandfather might have used in the last war. The metal was cold, the stock cracked, and the strap dug into my shoulder like a punishment. My fingers were too small for the trigger guard, and when I tried to lift it, the barrel dipped toward the ground. It wasn't just the weight of iron, I felt. It was the weight of a dying empire resting on the hands of children. The sergeant's voice split the morning air. "For Germany, for the Führer." His words bounced off the walls of the destroyed schoolhouse, hollow and desperate. Around me, boys tried to mimic the salute, their arms trembling. Some couldn't hold their weapons straight. Others had tears frozen on their faces, streaks of dirt tracing the outlines of lost innocence. When my turn came, I tried to lift the rifle higher, to look like the soldier they wanted me to be. My muscles burned. The weapon swayed in my grip. The sergeant stopped in front of me, his face shadowed under his helmet. He didn't shout this time, he just stared for a long moment, his jaw tight, before moving on. I think he saw it, the fear I couldn't hide. He barked another command, and we lined up outside. The sky was bruised with smoke, And somewhere beyond the gray horizon, the Americans were advancing. "You will hold the line," he said. "You will die if you must." I didn't understand why dying was now part of our duty. I looked at the rifle again. Its bolt was stiff with rust, the wood dark with old sweat and oil. The weapon had probably outlived 3 soldiers already, each one replaced by someone younger, smaller, more expendable. I pressed my cheek against the cold stock and felt the sting of metal against skin. It didn't feel like honor. It felt like an ending. One of the older bows beside me, Otto, leaned close. "Don't worry," he whispered. "They'll never get this far." His voice tried to sound sure, but his hands trembled just like mine. He was 14, maybe 15, but his eyes had already seen more than any child should. When the drill began, the sergeant made us crawl through the mud, aim at broken windows, and pretend we were shooting invaders. I tried to follow orders, but every shot that echoed from the training field made me flinch, my shoulder bruised from the recoil. Each pull of the trigger felt like betrayal, of myself, of the life I once had, of the mother who still believed I was safe. At night, I sat by a small fire with the others. Our breath rose like smoke, our stomachs empty. The sergeant walked among us, inspecting rifles, muttering about bravery and sacrifice. He stopped again when he saw me rubbing my aching arms. "Pain," he said, "is what makes a man." Then he moved on, but I didn't feel like a man. I felt like a scared bull hiding inside an oversized coat, clutching a rifle that belonged to ghosts. Before sleep, I thought of my mother. She used to hum while hanging laundry, the sound soft and distant now, almost forgotten. She still believed in victory, in the radio voices that spoke of secret weapons and miracles. If she saw me like this, covered in dirt, shaking, barely able to stand, would she still believe? The wind carried the faint thunder of artillery from the west. The ground seemed to tremble beneath us. I wrapped my arms around the rifle to keep warm, its weight pressing against my chest like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I realized then that the weapon I held wasn't meant to protect me. It was meant to make me part of the lie that bows could stop the war. April 1945. The lie of the hero. By the third day, the city square became our stage for lies. Loudspeakers crackled with speeches from men who still believed words could stop the enemy's advance. They called it the defense of the fatherland. We were told we were heroes, saviors of a collapsing dream. Flags fluttered above shattered buildings, and a portrait of the Fuhrer hung crooked against the wall of the town hall, its glass cracked through the eyes. An officer of the party arrived that morning, his uniform immaculate despite the dust that clung to everything else. He stood on the steps and began to speak with a voice like thunder, rolling over the crowd of trembling boys, wounded men, and desperate mothers. He promised victory, medals, and eternal glory. He said that the fatherland would rise again, that our names would be remembered. But as he spoke, I saw the truth written on every face. No one believed him anymore. The soldiers in front of him nodded, but their eyes were empty. One man, his leg bandaged and his face pale, tried to stand at attention. His hand trembled as he saluted. When the officer turned away, I saw tears glistening beneath the grime on his cheeks. It was the only honest thing left in that square. The officer finished his speech with a shout, "Victory or death." And the crowd echoed weakly, voices breaking apart like the buildings around us. Then he smiled, as if proud of the ruin he commanded. Behind him, the horizon burned. I felt my stomach twist. They called us heroes, but we were only children in tattered uniforms. My rifle hung from my shoulder, too heavy, too real. When I looked down at my boots, I noticed they weren't even mine. They had been taken from another boy who hadn't returned. The mud on them wasn't from training, it was from a grave. After the speech, the officer came down from the steps, handing out small iron crosses wrapped in paper. "For bravery," he said to each of us. When he reached me, he pinned one on my chest. The metal was cold, and the pin pricked my skin. "You'll make your mother proud," he told me. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think there was still something noble in what we were doing. But behind him, I saw a truck filled with bodies covered by a tarp, waiting to be buried outside the city. That image stayed with me more than his words. Later that afternoon, I wandered through the ruins, past what used to be a bakery, now nothing but bricks and ash. The air reeked of smoke and wet dust. Somewhere, A church bell rang once and fell silent, its rope probably burned, its tower half gone. I sat on a broken stone wall, staring at the metal on my chest, and wondered if a piece of metal could erase fear. Otto found me there, his face gray with soot. "You got one too," he said, touching the metal lightly. "Maybe that means we'll survive." I tried to smile, but the sound of distant gunfire made us both turn our heads. The Americans were closer. That night, we were pulled to sleep near the edge of town, close to where the next line of defense would be. The officer's speech still echoed in my ears, all the talk of heroes and glory. But as I lay there with my rifle across my knees, I realized something I hadn't before. Heroes don't beg for food, or cry in their sleep, or dream of their mothers. Heroes don't tremble when they pull the trigger. We weren't heroes. We were the last shadows of a dying army, and even the shadows were fading. April 1945. The invisible enemy. The night the first shots echoed through the valley, the air itself seemed to stop breathing. Someone shouted that the Americans had crossed the river. Orders were barked through the darkness, sharp and broken, as we scrambled to our positions. The moon was hidden behind smoke, and every flicker of light felt like a target painted on our backs. They gave us shovels and told us to dig. The earth was hard, frozen in places, wet in others. My hands blistered as I clawed at the dirt, my nails blackened and torn. The sergeant said, "Dig fast, boys. They're close." We dug until our fingers bled. The ground smelled of oil and death. Somewhere beneath us, old shells and bones slept together. When we finally crouched inside the shallow trench, my arms trembled from exhaustion. Around me, the boys were silent. Otto was next to me again, his breath visible in the cold. He gripped his rifle tight, his lips moving in a prayer I couldn't hear. Someone coughed, and the sergeant hissed for silence. Only the wind answered. Then came the sound, a low, distant hum that grew louder each second. Engines, dozens of them. I looked up and saw faint lights drifting across the sky like fireflies. They moved fast, in formation. For a moment, I thought they were stars. Then the first explosion hit. The ground jumped beneath me. Dust and dirt rained down like hail. I covered my head, ears ringing as the air split open. The Americans weren't here yet, but their planes were, faceless and distant, dropping death without warning. I tried to see them, but the glare of the flames blinded me. It didn't feel like we were fighting an enemy anymore. It felt like the world itself had turned against us. When the bombing stopped, silence returned, thick, suffocating. Somewhere to my left, a boy screamed for his mother. No one answered. The sergeant moved along the trench, his coat torn, shouting that we had to hold the position. That there was nothing left to hold. The sky glowed orange, and the forest on the hill burned like a torch. We waited for the enemy to come on foot. Hours passed. Every sound made us flinch. The creak of metal, the snap of branches, the faint hum of engines far away. "They'll come at dawn," Otto whispered, his voice shook. His eyes were fixed on the distance. I didn't respond. I just stared at my hands, still trembling, still dirty from the earth I dug. A grave I wasn't sure wasn't my own. When the horizon began to pale, the sergeant ordered us to prepare. My rifle felt heavier than ever, the barrel slick with dew. I checked the bolt like he'd taught us, though I barely knew what I was doing. The only thing I truly understood was fear. Then, through the fog, came the sound of boots, not ours, the clatter of metal, the low murmur of voices in a language I didn't understand. The Americans, my breath caught in my throat. "Hold," the sergeant whispered. "Wait until they're close." The mist shifted, and I saw shapes moving. Dark, solid, human. They were still far, but close enough for me to see the flash of helmets, the glint of rifles. My heart hammered in my chest. I thought of my mother, of the empty kitchen, of her promise that everything would be fine. The sergeant raised his arm, ready to shout the command to fire. I tightened my grip on the rifle, but my hands were slick with sweat. I could hear the Americans speaking now, calm, unaware of us. They weren't demons. They were just men, tired men, walking through ruins like we were. But none of that mattered. Orders were orders. I looked at the sky once more, the same gray sky that had watched us dig, watched us bleed, watched us lie. And in that sky, the invisible enemy lingered. Not the soldiers coming toward us, but the silence between every heartbeat, the fear that had turned children into soldiers before the first bullet had ever been fired. April 1945. The bow and the torn map. When the sun rose, the world was painted in gray and ash. The sergeant was gone, vanished sometime in the night. Only 5 of us remained in the trench, half-starved, shaking, waiting for an attack that never came. We didn't know whether we were still soldiers or just ghosts who hadn't realized it yet. A corporal, older than the rest, crawled over the edge and called us out. "The front is broken," he said. "We're pulling back." His voice was cracked, his uniform torn. He looked like a man made of dust. We followed him through the ruins, past burned fields and wrecked wagons, until we reached what was left of a farmhouse. There, he spread a map across the ground. It was a map of Germany, edges burnt, corners missing. Lines of blue and red cut through it like veins. He traced them with his finger, muttering under his breath. "They've taken Cologne, Frankfurt, Nuremberg." He paused, then looked up. "Berlin." His voice faltered. "Berlin doesn't exist anymore." Silence fell. Even the wind seemed to stop. I stared at the map as if it could answer the question that none of us dared to ask. If the heart was gone, what was left to defend? The corporal tore the map into pieces. He handed one to each of us. "When he gave me mine, he said, 'Keep it. It's the last piece of our country you'll ever hold.'" His eyes were empty when he said it. I folded the scrap carefully and slipped it into my pocket. It smelled faintly of smoke and oil, like everything else. Somewhere beneath that soot was the land I once knew, the street where I played marbles, the school with the tall oak tree, the small bakery that smelled of rye and cinnamon. All gone, replaced by this mud, silence, and orders. That night, we camped in a barn with holes in the roof. Through them, I could see the stars. Otto lay beside me, clutching his rifle like a pillow. "Do you think the Americans will stop if Berlin falls?" he whispered. I didn't answer. The war had already fallen. It just hadn't realized it yet. April 1945. The house that would never be home again. By morning, I couldn't stand it anymore. I left before the others woke. I still knew the road that led back to my village, or what was left of it. The fields were blackened, the fences splintered, the trees shredded by gunfire. I walked alone, my rifle slung across my back, my pocket heavy with the torn piece of the map. When I reached the edge of the village, I stopped. Smoke still drifted from the ruins. The air was thick with silence, the kind that follows screams. My house stood at the end of the road, half its roof gone. The windows were shattered, the door hung crooked on one hinge. Inside, everything was still. The table was overturned, the dishes broken. My mother's shawl lay on the floor, covered in dust. I picked it up and pressed it to my face, hoping for the faintest trace of her scent, but there was only the cold smell of stone and ash. On the wall, written in charcoal, were the words, "They come to liberate." I didn't understand. Liberate who? From what? The walls were empty, the house hollow. Liberation had no meaning when everything you loved had already been taken. I sat on the floor, surrounded by silence, trying to remember the sound of her voice. My hands shook. For the first time, I began to wonder if the enemy was not the soldiers crossing the fields, but the fear that had made men send children to fight for ghosts. As I left the house, I looked back once. The word liberate shimmered in the sunlight streaming through a hole in the roof. I didn't feel liberated. I felt lost. I knew then that even if I found my mother, even if the war ended tomorrow, this place would never be home again. April 1945. The ambush. By nightfall, I found the others again. They were hiding near the main road, 5 boys crouched behind a wrecked wagon. A new officer had taken charge, a thin man with hollow cheeks and eyes that burned with the last spark of fanaticism. He told us an American convoy was expected at dawn. "You will attack," he said. "Surprise them. Show no mercy." We nodded, though none of us believed the words. The officer handed out ammunition and disappeared into the darkness. We were left alone, children waiting for death disguised as orders. The air was cold, the stars blurred behind drifting smoke. Otto sat beside me, chewing on a piece of dry bread. "They say the Americans bring chocolate," he muttered, half smiling. "Maybe we'll capture some." His voice cracked on the last word. At first light, we heard engines, low and steady, approaching from the west. I peered over the edge of the wagon. A line of trucks moved slowly along the road, white flags painted on their sides. I blinked. They weren't carrying soldiers. They were filled with crates, food, bandages, water, relief supplies. They're not armed, I whispered. The others didn't move. We just stared as the first truck drew closer, its canvas cover flapping in the wind. For a brief, fragile moment, I thought maybe the war was truly over. Maybe we could throw down our rifles, step out of hiding, and ask for mercy. But then, I heard the safety of a rifle click beside me. One of the woes, I think his name was Klaus, had his weapon raised, eyes wide, breath quick. He whispered something I couldn't hear, and before I could stop him, he fired. The shot cracked through the air like lightning. The convoy screeched to a halt. For one heartbeat, the world went silent. Then the Americans answered. The roar of machine guns tore through the ruins, through the dirt, through us. I felt the ground explode beside me. Otto shouted my name, but I couldn't hear him. My vision blurred. I dropped the rifle, stumbled forward, and then, a flash of white pain. Something struck my shoulder. The world spun sideways. I fell onto the cold ground, face against the mud. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the American flag painted on the side of the nearest truck, bright, clean, and utterly unreachable. April 1945. The shot. When I woke, the air was heavy with the smell of gunpowder and burning oil. The sky above me was gray, turning to red near the horizon. My shoulder throbbed with pain, wet and sticky beneath the torn fabric of my coat. I tried to move, but my body refused. Every breath came like a knife. Around me, the road was littered with silence, broken rifles, shattered helmets, and the faint moan of someone still alive. I remembered the sound of the gunfire. Deafening, endless. The Americans had answered Klaus's shot with fury. They didn't know we were just bows. How could they? From their trucks, they'd seen uniforms, rifles, muzzle flashes, soldiers, enemies. Somewhere nearby, Otto called my name. I turned my head slowly and saw him crawling through the mud toward me, his leg bleeding, eyes wide with terror. "Don't move," he whispered, clutching my sleeve. "They're still here," but the Americans were already advancing, careful and silent. I saw them moving between the wrecks, rifles raised, shadows against the smoke. They moved like hunters, quick and trained, their helmets glinting faintly in the dim light. One of them stopped when he saw me. He shouted something in English, and another man approached, lowering his weapon slightly. I tried to speak, to say we're just children, but only blood filled my mouth. My vision blurred again, fading into white nose and echoing boots. Someone shouted medic, and the world disappeared. When I came to, the battle was over. The Americans were collecting weapons, tending to their wounded. Our rifles lay in a pile, useless now. Klaus was gone. I never saw him again. Otto sat beside me, staring blankly at the sky. "They didn't kill us," he murmured. His voice sounded far away. "Maybe the war's over, but for me, it wasn't over. Not yet." The pain in my shoulder pulsed like a second heartbeat. I closed my eyes and saw it again. The moment I froze, the hesitation, the flash, the shot that ended everything. April 1945. The olive-green sky. I woke beneath a canvas sheet that smelled of antiseptic and smoke. The air buzzed with distant engines and soft murmurs. When I opened my eyes, a man in olive-green uniform was kneeling beside me. His face was rough, his beard patchy, his eyes the color of mud after rain. He offered me a canteen. "Easy, kid," he said quietly. His accent was strange, but his tone wasn't harsh. He lifted my head and poured water onto my cracked lips. "You're lucky," he added, glancing at my shoulder. It went clean through. I tried to sit, but he gently pushed me back. The pain flared again, sharp and real. Around us, other soldiers moved, Americans, setting up tents, hauling supplies, checking maps. The field where the ambush had taken place was now an aid post. The man checked my bandage and nodded. "You'll live," he said simply. For the first time in months, someone had said that to me, and meant it. I studied his face. He looked tired. Not angry, not cruel, just worn down by too many days of the same misery. His hands were rough, but when he tightened the bandage, his touch was careful, almost gentle. He looked at me for a long moment, then asked softly, How old are you? I hesitated. 12, he exhaled, almost laughing, but it wasn't amusement. It was disbelief, or pity. 12, he repeated. Jesus, he shook his head and muttered something under his breath that I didn't understand. The sun broke through the clouds for a moment, lighting his uniform. The color, olive green, shimmered like a forest after rain. I stared at it, realizing that for months I'd been told to hate that color. But here it was, saving me. As he stood to leave, he placed a small piece of chocolate beside me. Eat, he said, pointing to it. You need it. Then he walked away. I watched him go, wondering how a man dressed in the color of the enemy could seem more human than any of the officers who had shouted glory. Back home, the war had painted the sky olive green, and beneath it, for the first time, I began to see the truth. April 1945, the man who didn't pull the trigger. His name was Frank. I learned it 2 days later, when I could finally sit up. He came back to check on me, carrying a metal cup of soup and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Name's Frank, he said, pointing at himself. Then he gestured to me. You, Emil, I whispered. My voice sounded small, foreign. He nodded. Good to meet you, Emil. Frank stayed longer that time, talking quietly, while the others worked. He told me he was from Ohio, that he had a wife and a son about my age. Tommy, he said, pulling a small photo from his pocket. It showed a boy standing in a cornfield, squinting against the sun, grinning. Looks like you a little, Frank said with a faint smile. I looked at the photo for a long time. The boy's eyes were bright, full of life and touched by fear. He had no rifle slung across his shoulder, no dirt smeared across his face. I handed the picture back carefully. Frank watched me, then said softly, "The war's over for you, kid. You hear me? Over." I wanted to believe him. But the word over didn't mean anything yet. I'd seen too many men say it before dying the next day. Still, something in his voice, quiet, certain, settled inside me like warmth in the cold. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a small piece of bread. Eat, he said, no tricks. I took it. My hands were still shaking. Why didn't you kill us? I asked, barely audible. He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted toward the horizon where smoke still rose in the distance. Because I saw your face, he finally said. I saw my son's. He stood, tightening the strap of his rifle. Rest, he murmured. The trucks will come tomorrow. When he walked away, I stared after him. The image of the photo burned into my mind. A boy in a field, smiling, a face that looked like hope. That night, as I lay under the olive-green sky, I realized that one man's mercy had done what no speech, no flag, no medal ever could. It made me feel human again. April 1945, the camp of survivors. By the time they moved me, I could walk again. Slowly, one hand pressed to my bandaged shoulder. The Americans loaded us into the back of a truck, not as prisoners, but as something else. I didn't know what to call it then. We weren't enemies anymore, but we weren't free either. Just survivors drifting between two wars. The one outside, and the one that had already taken root inside us. The truck drove through miles of wreckage. Towns that had once been alive were now gray skeletons, smoke curling from roofs that would never be repaired. When we stopped, I saw a field filled with tents, vehicles, and wounded people, both soldiers and civilians. An American flag fluttered weakly above it all, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. They called it a collection camp. To me, it felt like a graveyard waiting to happen. I was guided to a tent where a nurse, young, with tired eyes, cleaned my wound again. Her touch was gentle, but her silence said more than any words. I looked around and saw faces from every side of the war. Women with hollow eyes, boys in rags, old men clutching canes made from branches. No one spoke of victory. There was no such thing here. That night, I sat outside the tent beside Otto. His leg was bandaged, but he was alive. They gave me food, he said quietly, staring into the distance. Real food. He showed me a tin of beans, half-eaten, as if it were gold. Maybe they don't hate us, he added, half a question, half a confession. I looked around. The Americans walked among us, checking bandages, sharing cigarettes with those who still had the strength to hold them. There were no shouts, no orders, no propaganda. Only the tired rhythm of people breathing after too much death. Somewhere nearby, an old German officer still tried to rally the few men who would listen. "Don't trust them," he hissed. "They'll kill us all." But no one cared anymore. His voice was too small against the sound of the wind moving through the broken trees. Later, I saw Frank again. He nodded at me, as if we shared a secret the others couldn't understand. I wanted to thank him, but the words refused to form. Maybe he already knew. That night, the camp fell quiet under the cold stars. I lay awake, listening to the murmurs of people dreaming or remembering. For the first time in months, there were no bombs, no gunfire, just breathing, just life, fragile and uncertain. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was something close. And for a boy who had forgotten what peace even sounded like, that was enough. April 1945, the chaplain's sermon. The next morning, the Americans gathered everyone near the edge of the camp. A man stood on a wooden crate, holding a small Bible in one hand. His uniform bore no rank, only a cross stitched onto his collar. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, soft enough to carry through the quiet. "I am not here to preach victory," he said. "I am here because we have all lost something." I didn't understand every word, but his tone reached me. Even through the barrier of language, it carried warmth. He spoke of forgiveness, of rebuilding what war had tried to erase. He said God didn't choose sides, only hearts. Around me, some of the older soldiers looked away, unwilling to hear, but others, even some in gray uniforms, listened. A woman beside me began to cry, not loudly, just a sound like breath breaking. I wanted to ask the chaplain if God could forgive those who never chose to fight, but my voice wouldn't come. When the sermon ended, he stepped down and began walking through the crowd, offering small pieces of bread. When he reached me, he smiled gently. "Hungry?" he asked. I nodded. He pressed the bread into my hand. "You're safe now," he said, then hesitated, studying me. "How old?" 12, I whispered. He looked down, his expression tightening. "Too young," he murmured. "Far too young for any of this." He made the sign of the cross above my head, not as a ritual, but as something softer, human. Then he moved on. I ate the bread slowly, watching him walk through the sea of broken faces. For the first time, I realized the Americans didn't just see enemies, they saw people. That night, Otto and I talked quietly. "Do you believe what he said?" he asked. I thought for a moment. "I don't know," I said. "But I want to." The chaplain's voice echoed in my head as I drifted toward sleep. God does not choose sides, only hearts. I didn't know if I believed in God anymore, not after what I'd seen. But maybe that didn't matter. Maybe belief wasn't about winning. Maybe it was just about surviving with your soul still intact. April 1945. The letter I never sent. Days passed. The war outside grew quieter, as if the world itself was holding its breath. In the camp, some people began to smile again. The Americans shared rations, even let the younger ones help with chores. For the first time, I saw Otto laugh, a small, fragile sound that vanished as soon as it came, but it was real. One afternoon, a soldier handed out paper and pencils. "Write home," he said, pointing to the pile. "We'll send them when we can." I stared at the blank page for hours before the words came. "Dear Mama, I'm alive. I was hurt, but they fixed me. The Americans are kind. I have food and a bed. Please don't worry anymore." I stopped, my hand trembled. What could I tell her about what I had done? About the boys who never came back, about the faces that still haunted my dreams. I wanted to tell her that I was sorry, for fighting, for believing, for surviving when others hadn't, but I couldn't find the words. I folded the letter carefully and handed it to a medic. He promised to send it with the next truck east, but deep down, I knew it would never reach her. Maybe she was already gone. Maybe the letter would be lost on some broken road, scattered like the ashes of everything we'd been. That night, I lay awake, thinking of home, the scent of bread baking, the sound of her voice humming softly while I read by the window. I tried to imagine her opening that letter, smiling through tears, whispering my name. But another thought came instead. Maybe it was better she never knew. Maybe the image of her son should remain as she remembered him, a boy with ink-stained hands, not blood-stained ones. I closed my eyes, And the letter felt like a confession I would never speak aloud. In the distance, thunder rolled, though the sky was clear. I wondered if it was the sound of the war ending, or the echo of everything it had already taken. April 1945. The silent judgment. The trucks brought more prisoners every day, men in black uniforms, their faces pale and defiant. The camp guard separated them from the rest of us. They wore the insignia of the SS, the very symbol we had been taught to revere. But now, even among Germans, those black uniforms inspired nothing but silence. I remember standing near the fence when they marched past. Some limped, others kept their heads high, but all of them looked hollow, like statues chipped away by guilt. The Americans watched them closely, rifles in hand. Though they didn't shout or strike, they didn't have to. The silence itself was punishment enough. One of the SS men turned his head as he passed and met my eyes. His gaze was sharp, heavy, as if he could see everything I had done, or failed to do. He stopped for a second, his lips curling into a word I couldn't mistake. Traitor. The sound sliced deeper than any bullet. I lowered my head, unable to meet his eyes again. My uniform was gone, replaced by a borrowed American coat, but the shame still clung to me. I had been a soldier, a child, a pawn. And now, nothing at all. Later that day, I sat alone behind one of the medical tents. Frank found me there, crouched with my knees pulled to my chest. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his voice low, gentle. I didn't answer, my throat felt tight. He followed my gaze toward the group of captured officers. "Don't listen to them," he said. "They'd call anyone a traitor who stopped dying for them." I looked up at him. "But I was one of them." Frank shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "You were just born in the wrong uniform." He walked away after that, leaving me with the echo of his words. I thought about them for hours, about how a uniform could turn a child into an enemy, a hero into a ghost. The men in black had chosen their path. I never had the chance to choose mine. That night, when I saw their convoy leave for interrogation, I felt no triumph, only pity. They still believed they were fighting for something worth dying for. I had stopped believing in that long ago. All I wanted now was to remember how to live. May 1945. The photograph of Frank, the morning the Americans began dismantling the camp. The air felt different, lighter somehow, though no one said why. Rumors whispered through the tents. "The war is over." No one cheered. It didn't seem real. Peace felt like a word from another language, one none of us remembered how to speak. Frank found me sitting near the fence, tracing circles in the dust with a stick. He crouched beside me, his uniform freshly cleaned, ready for departure. "They're sending us west," he said. "You'll be moved soon too." I nodded. I didn't ask where I was going. It didn't matter, there was nowhere left to go. Frank hesitated, then reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out a small, worn photograph and handed it to me. "Here," he said. It was the same one he had shown me before, him and his son standing in a sunlit cornfield. "Keep it," he said, closing my fingers around it. "Maybe one day, you'll see a sky like that again." I looked at him, unsure what to say. "Will you go home?" I asked quietly. He nodded. "Yeah. Ohio. My wife's waiting. My beau too." He paused, his eyes distant. "But I'll never forget this place. Or you, Emil." The words caught me off guard. I wanted to thank him, to say that he had saved more than just my life, that he had reminded me what mercy looked like, but before I could, he stood. "Take care of yourself, kid," he said. And then he was gone. I stared at the photograph for a long time. The faces on it smiled in a way I had forgotten was possible. A father and son, side by side, untouched by war. That night, I lay in my cot, holding the picture to my chest. For the first time since the world had fallen apart, I didn't feel completely alone. Somewhere across the ocean, there was still kindness, still warmth, still something human. And if that existed, even in one man's heart, then maybe all was not lost. May 1945. The ashes of the Reich. The next day, word spread through the camp. Germany had surrendered. Some cry. Others simply sat in silence, as if unsure whether to feel relief or grief. The war that had devoured the world was over, yet it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like waking from a nightmare only to find the house burned down. The Americans fired a few flares into the sky, bright bursts of light that painted the ruins in ghostly colors. For a moment, it almost looked like fireworks. A few people clapped weakly, but most just stared. The celebration of peace felt too small for the weight of everything lost. I walked to the edge of the field, where a line of broken trees marked the boundary between the camp and the empty land beyond. From there, I could see the remains of a village, smoke curling from chimneys that no longer had homes beneath them. Some of the German officers still spoke of honor, of rebuilding the Reich, but their words sounded hollow, absurd even. There was no Reich left, only ashes. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the scrap of map the corporal had given me weeks before. The edges were frayed now, the ink smeared. I looked at it under the fading light and realized it meant nothing anymore. The borders, the cities, the pride, all gone. The piece of paper I had once clung to as a symbol of home was now just a relic of a lie, so I let it go. The wind caught it and carried it away, swirling it into the dusk until it vanished among the trees. Behind me, someone began to sing. A quiet, broken tune in German, the kind mothers used to hum to their children before sleep. I closed my eyes and listened. The world was ending. Yes, but something else was beginning to. Not victory, not glory, just survival. And in that fragile silence between what was gone and what might still come, I felt something I hadn't dared to feel in a long time. Hope. May 1945. The return. When they finally let us go, the war had already turned to whispers. The trucks that once carried soldiers to the front now carried survivors back through ruins that used to be cities. The Americans gave me a coat, a bit of bread, and directions east, home, one of them said with a nod. The word sounded unfamiliar, like a song I used to know but had forgotten the melody of. I walked for days, following roads that no longer had names. The fields were empty, stripped bare by hunger and fire. Every village I passed looked the same. Shattered windows, blackened walls, silence. Dogs barked from inside burned-out barns, but no people came to the door. Sometimes I found scraps of newspapers blowing through the streets, headlines declaring peace, freedom, surrender. They felt like jokes told to the dead. By the fourth day, I reached what had once been my village. The road curved past the orchard where I used to steal apples with my friends. Now the trees stood like skeletons, branches bare. The bell tower was gone. The church roof collapsed. Half the village had been swallowed by smoke and time. I found the remains of my house by instinct more than memory. The walls were still there, but the roof had caved in. Moss had begun to grow on the bricks, as if nature itself was trying to erase what had happened. I stepped through the doorway. The air smelled of dust and ashes. The table was gone, the bed broken, but on the wall, still faint beneath the soot, I saw the words written months ago. They come to liberate. The letters were fading now, barely visible. I ran my fingers over them, feeling nothing but the rough surface of stone. Liberation, it had come. Yes, but what was left to liberate? Outside, I heard footsteps. A man approached, carrying a bucket of water. He was older, thin, his coat too big for his frame. When he saw me, he froze. Then his eyes widened with something like recognition. "Emil," he said softly. It was Herr Weber, our old neighbor. His beard was gray now, his face marked by years of loss. "I thought you were dead," he said, after a long silence. "You were one of the bows they took." I nodded, unable to speak. He looked around at the ruins, then back at me. "You came home," he murmured, almost to himself. "You came back." I glanced at the wreckage of my house and shook my head. "No," I said quietly, "I didn't come home. I just came back." We stood there, two survivors in a place that no longer remembered us. The wind moved through the empty streets, carrying the faint smell of spring. Wet soil, new grass fighting through the ashes. As I left, I looked back once more. The village, the house, the words on the wall, all fading into dust. I realized then that I wasn't returning to what had been. I was walking toward what might still be. And for the first time, the road ahead didn't look like an ending, it looked like a beginning. May 1945. The forgiveness I never asked for. Years later, I returned to Germany as a man, not a soldier. The war had become history, printed in books and whispered by those who had survived it. Cities had risen from the ashes, trains ran again, Children laughed in streets that no longer smelled of smoke. Yet inside me, the war never truly ended. It lived in memories that time refused to bury. One autumn afternoon, I found myself standing in an American cemetery near Hurtgen. The air was cold, the grass impossibly green. White crosses stretched across the hillside, in perfect rows, each one marked with a name, and some with none at all. I carried a small bouquet of wildflowers. My hands trembled as I laid them on one of the nameless graves. I didn't know who rested there. Maybe he had been in the convo that day. Maybe he had been the one who fired the bullet that tore through my shoulder. Or maybe he had been Frank's friend, the man who gave me water and called me kid. It didn't matter anymore. For a long time, I just stood there, listening to the wind. I thought of Frank's photograph, still folded inside my wallet after all these years. A man and his son in a cornfield, smiling beneath a blue sky. I remembered his voice, quiet and steady. "The war's over for you, kid." He had been right. The war was over, but forgiveness had taken a lifetime to find. I closed my eyes and whispered the only words that felt true. "I'm sorry." Then, softer, "Thank you." The breeze carried my words away across the rows of crosses, and for the first time since I was 12 years old, the silence that followed didn't feel like punishment, it felt like peace.